Thank you for that very generous introduction, Muddassir. Again, thank you to Professor Quamar for this invitation to speak to you today. And second, to those who are celebrating Ramadan Kareem, I hope that my remarks will not egregiously delay anyone's iftar dinner this evening, inshallah. And finally, I would just also like to say that the current COVID crisis in India is, of course, top of mind for so many here in the UAE and also among our colleagues and diasporic friends in the United States and back in the United Kingdom. So our well wishes are with you and your loved ones. To a slightly lighter subject, I guess, let's turn and start with a spy story and some intelligence chatter to begin with. Muddassir, can you just advance the slide? So in this and many similar intelligence reports, Saleh Munir Pasha, the Ottoman ambassador to Paris, repeatedly warned his superiors in Istanbul and the British Empire, that the British Empire was engaged in a sweeping strategy to transfer the Ottoman Caliphate to the Sharif of Mecca and bring it under the sway of Britain's Indian Empire. By doing so, he believed that the British planned to bring the Hijaz, Najd, and Iraq under British protection and eventually turn them into colonies, not unlike Aden or India itself. Despite this dramatic tone, what is perhaps most notable about the ambassador's somewhat breathless claims of diabolical plots is their utter ordinariness in this period. From around 1880 onward, this genre of intelligence reportage emerges as a ubiquitous feature of Ottoman archival collections from the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II and the empire's final years leading up through World War I. If you can advance the next slide. There are lengthy briefs from Ottoman diplomatic personnel from London to Bombay. We find an almost endless supply of translations and press clippings from European, Egyptian, and Indian newspapers dedicated to this subject. There were also colorful reports from spies and informants, so-called journal gilaire, shadowing anti-Ottoman propagandists in the region. And we can really get a sense of the kind of paranoia that Istanbul must have felt by this sort of British encirclement from the Mediterranean through, of course, the protectorate, the occupation of Egypt, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Aden, British presence in the Persian Gulf, and of course, India itself. So there was this feeling of encirclement, certainly in the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea. If you'll advance to the next slide. In one such journalgy report from 1910, an Ottoman informant warns of the rapidly multiplying Indian population in Mecca. As he warns, the Indian population numbered in the tens of thousands and had doubled several times over in recent years. A cursory glance at these numbers gives us some credence to the informant's concerns. By 1880, the British consulate estimated that in Mecca alone, the Indian colony had reached as many as 15,000 persons. By the close of the century, British subjects in the Hijaz, the bulk of which were Indian Muslims, accounted for at least 1/7 of the province's total urban population, perhaps as many as 400,000 at that time. In Jeddah alone, there were over 300 Indian families, and as a result, over half of all Hijazi trade flowed through Indian hands. In short, Indians constituted both the largest diasporic community in the Hijaz and the largest contingent of annual pilgrims each year. In many ways, Mecca was as much an Indian or Indian Ocean space as it was an Arab, Ottoman, or Middle Eastern one. Now, as our Ottoman informant hypothesizes, the British had undertaken a project to encourage Indians to take up residence in the Hijaz with the intention of using them to lay the groundwork for their ultimate goal of transferring the caliphate to the Sharif of Mecca. As proof of this scheme, the author cites a recently published article in the pro-British Egyptian newspaper Al-Muqatam, which had apparently been translated and circulated in the European press. The piece supporting British designs on moving the caliphate to Mecca was anonymously signed an Indian in Mecca. Here, our Ottoman informant paints a scene worthy of a Hollywood spy thriller. He claims to have set out to uncover the identity of this Indian author. In the course of his inquiries, he discovers that the author had recently arrived in Cairo. The informant goes on to detail the whereabouts of what he believes to be this mystery Indian spy in service of the English crown. Tracing his movements from the offices of Al-Muqatam through the alleys and coffee houses of the Khan al-Khalili Bazaar, In the end, however, our spy claims that his subject escaped back to Mecca and melted away into the steamship traffic back to Jeddah. Now, likely this genealogy report is something of a fiction, right? But what's most striking about this evocative fragment from Cairo, regardless of its actual veracity, is that while it warns of precisely the same kind of vague plot to transfer the caliphate as those uncovered, quote unquote, by the Ottoman ambassador in Paris and countless others, the genealogy's version hints at something specific, a deeper cluster of anxieties about the Ottoman state's inability to control the Hijaz's heterogeneous mobile populations, whether Bedouin or foreign pilgrims, and strengthen its territorial sovereignty over this traditionally autonomous province. Due to its sacred status, the Hijaz, of course, was never an ideal or even realistic candidate for occupation, annexation, or formal colonial rule. Likewise, both British imaginings and Ottoman fears of a colonial plot to transfer or otherwise manipulate the caliphate, at least until the cataclysmic events of World War I and the Arab Revolt, remained entirely in the realm of fantasy. However, as this report suggests, in the final decades of the 19th century, Britain's creeping involvement with the day-to-day affairs of the Hajj and its diasporic colonial subjects had forced Ottoman officials to acknowledge the Hijaz's vulnerable position as a contested frontier in an inter-imperial borderland. You can advance the slide, please. Now, the vexing questions that these anxieties raised form my book's core subjects. The book asks how European imperialism, the advent of steamship transport, and the increasingly interconnected nature of the Muslim world changed the traditional complexion of Ottoman pilgrimage administration. In turn, how did the rise of colonial rule in the Muslim world alter the Ottoman Empire's relation with non-Ottoman Muslims or colonial Muslims? Did the diaspora of Indian Muslims in the Hijaz really represent the cat's paw of British imperial influence? Did the Ottoman state actually consider ordinary pilgrims and diasporic subjects of Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia living in Mecca, Jeddah, or Medina to be potential fifth columns? Did they really believe that? Now, to be very clear, I think that there's no evidence to suggest that Ottoman officials believed foreign Muslims themselves were actually a seditious threat to the Ottoman state. However, by virtue of their acquisition of colonial nationalities and the extraterritorial legal claims that they entailed, foreign pilgrims provided a powerful pretext through which European states could interfere in the affairs of the Muslim holy places, quite a novel thing to have happen in the middle of the 19th century. As a result, Yildiz Palace was forced to impose previously unthinkable, even exclusionary policies to shield the territorial sovereignty of the Hijaz from the potential threats posed by ordinary pilgrims whose colonial passports and nationalities had to really come to unfairly mark them as potential pawns in a kind of game of hostile European geopolitics. In turn, this conceptual transformation of ordinary pilgrims into potentially dangerous foreign subjects opens a paradox. How should we square these anxieties with the Hamidian regime's promotion and even weaponization of supranational pan-Islamic solidarity and spiritual authority as tools of geopolitical strategy? On the other hand, how could a non-Muslim colonial empire like the Raj realistically hope to pose a credible challenge to the Ottoman Sultan Caliph's claims to Islamic legitimacy and sovereignty over the world's most sacred Islamic sites? How did the introduction of this new colonial element alter the shape of Ottoman governance in the Hijaz and even threaten to unravel the region's traditional system of layered sovereignty and power sharing between the central government and the Sharifate of Mecca? And finally, how did the late Ottoman states seek to defend itself and mitigate the symbiotic internal and external risks posed by this combustible mix of weak autonomous rule and aggressive colonial extraterritoriality? So taking this heightened sense of vulnerability as its point of departure, Imperial Mecca seeks to understand how colonialism arrived in the Ottoman Hijaz as a steamship stowaway. It tells the story of how the Hijaz and the Hajj were simultaneously reshaped by the competing dynamics forged between the ever-expanding reach of Britain's informal empire in the Indian Ocean and Arabia, and the nascent projects of frontier modernization that the Ottoman Empire deployed to shield its most sacred, most exceptional territory. It excavates the curiously understudied case of a faraway Ottoman, really, we might say, backward frontier province at the very heart of Islam and imperial legitimacy. It attempts to locate an enigmatic place caught between two imperial worlds, an Ottoman island adrift on a colonial ocean, lost in the gaping chasm between the area studies regions that we now quite artificially divide between Middle East and South Asia. Please advance this slide. Now, as I'll explain in more depth in just a moment, the steamship era Hajj that we see represented in this map here produced the first global crisis of what I would call Muslim mass mobility. Muslims in this era were racialized, pathologized, and singled out as both the carriers of dangerous microbes and subversive, even uniquely violent ideas. In many respects, the plight of steamship-going Muslims invites loose comparisons with today. Today, the Islamophobia of the post-9/11 era has branded Muslims worldwide, even the most vulnerable refugee populations, as potential terrorists, giving rise to additional border security, more stringent passport and visa controls, racial profiling, or even outright travel bans in the case of the Trump administration. While today's Islamophobia revolves around air traffic, immigration policies, and the assumed threat of Al-Qaeda or ISIS terrorists, such fears are not new, nor are they novel. Recent Western attempts to restrict Muslim mobility share a long intellectual lineage dating all the way back to the 18th. Although fears were not always grounded in reality, European colonial empires had the power to rewrite the terms of Muslim travel. This power affected the lives of millions of ordinary Muslims with only Muslim power. In this sense, the first global controversies over Muslim mobility also help us to understand the impossible dilemmas of Muslim imperial sovereignty in the age of European colonialism. In order to refocus our attention on how the Ottoman Empire dealt with this crisis, this book advocates a kind of change in perspective, one that builds on and engages with the colonial archive and its historiography of the Hajj, but it recenters the story of the Ottoman Empire and retells the entire story primarily through the lens of Ottoman, Turkish, and Arabic sources. In War I, argued beyond, the Hijaz and the Hajj became ensnared in a kind of asymmetrical clash of competing claims pitting the Ottoman Caliphate's sovereignty over the Haramain and the spiritual authority over non-Muslims living under colonial rule against the technological, military, diplomatic, and legal might of the British Empire, a non-Muslim state which nevertheless asserted its quizzical status as the world's most populous and most powerful, quote-unquote, Muslim empire. Imperial Mecca takes this dramatic role reversal as its central problem. I explore how the extraterritorial evolution of Britain's Indian Ocean pilgrimage bureaucracy presented an even broader challenge to the Ottoman Empire's traditional role as protector of the Hijaz and the Hajj. I detail how the advent of steam-based colonial Hajj radically altered the traditional duties and responsibilities of the Ottoman Sultan in his capacity as the servant of the two holy places. The Sultan Caliph really remained and was the legitimate sovereign responsible for the administration and protection of the land-based Hajj. And yet, custodianship of the steamship Hajj represented an almost entirely new field of governance. Ottoman custodianship was no longer just a matter of providing subsidies to the Bedouin, patronage to the denizens of the holy cities, and seasonal security for camel caravans from places like Egypt and Syria. The advent of the steamship and mass pilgrimage had altered the scope, scale, and global importance of the Hajj by several orders of magnitude. As a result, the Sultan Caliph was forced to shoulder what I consider a double burden. The Ottoman state had to continue its traditional duties and early modern practices of custodianship and to simultaneously coordinate its administration of the Hijaz and the steamship Hajj with rival colonial empires who were often using the Hajj itself as a way to undermine Ottoman legitimacy. So having laid out some of the big issues of the book, I'd like to do a brief overview of the structure and coverage of the various chapters. Please advance this slide. So in turn, I describe visions of this clash. In the wake of India's Great Revolt of 1857-58, British colonial administrators increasingly singled out Muslims as a racialized minority, uniquely predisposed to jihad and anti-colonial rebellion. In 1858, At the same time, by sheer coincidence, really, an almost wholly unrelated set of circumstances led to the massacre of Jeddah Christian population. For British officials, however, these two events blurred into a single narrative of anti-colonial conspiracy. Thus, even before cholera's arrival on the global stage in 1865-66, which marked Mecca as a perennial epidemic threat, the Hijaz had already emerged in the colonial imagination as a haven for fanatical Indian exiles and revolutionaries. From 1858 onward, colonial administrators repeatedly struggled to see the Hijaz or the Hajj through any other lens than the perceived threat by this supposedly radicalized trans-imperial Indian Muslim diaspora, or as an outlet for Ottoman pan-Islamic propaganda and conspiracy. Thus, in the decades that followed, colonial officials came to imagine the Hijaz and Indian Ocean steamship Hajj as dangerous spaces of colonial disorder, vehicles for both medical and political contagion. As British officials, though, became increasingly reliant on ethnographic knowledge to understand and control their Muslim subjects, they thoroughly conflated Islam and its institutions with the roots of anti-colonial subversion. At the same time, however, Islam also became central to the colonial state's efforts to represent itself as legitimate and to really legitimate its mission to its Muslim subjects in India and elsewhere. As a result, while colonial government engagement with the Hajj never fully outgrew its impulse to spy and monitor the pilgrimage to Mecca, over time, new understandings of the day-to-day mechanics and ordinary life of the Hajj. From the 1880s onward, efforts that had initially been driven exclusively by a thirst for medical and political intelligence gradually morphed into a more nuanced effort to position the colonial state as a facilitator, promoter, and even protector of Muslim rights to safe, clean. I tried to trace how the British constitution, both Muslim and Christian, began to poke holes in the Hijaz's exceptional religious and legal status. By the conclusion of the 19th century, the vast majority of the legal fabric of the Ottoman capitulations was stretched beyond recognition. Though the capitulations were never meant to apply to foreign Muslims living under colonial rule, and the Hijaz had always been explicitly exempted from these agreements. From the early 1880s onward, British consular officials waged an aggressive campaign to extend the privileges of consular protection to Indian and other colonial subjects traveling or residing in Hijaz. In turn, British India's extraterritorial protection of its pilgrimage subjects came to present an increasingly vexing challenge to Ottoman sovereignty. Here, I try to explain how the Ottoman Empire quickly learned and adopted new practices of Eurocentric international law to protect its sovereignty. Ultimately, this led to an edited volume with my colleagues in the field of studies, the subjects of Ottoman international law. And please advance to the next slide. In chapter 3, we move from legal epidemiological entanglements. And instead of asking how the global crises of cholera and pilgrimage regulation affected Europe, free trade, or its content, the Ottoman state was really fighting a war on two fronts. Once again, the Hijaz was caught in the long shadow of British India. As pilgrimage-related cholera outbreaks attracted ever more international attention, consular and colonial officials sought to exert greater extraterritorial authority over their colonial subjects during their time in the Hijaz. At the same time, however, even in the face of a mounting body of scientific evidence to the contrary, Britain repeatedly denied that India and its pilgrim masses were in any way responsible for the spread of cholera to the Hijaz and the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Thus, rather than supporting Ottoman and international quarantine initiatives, between the 1860s and 1890s, British anti-scientific denialism and propaganda emerged as the chief obstacle to the imposition of stricter international quarantine and travel regulations. Please advance to the next slide. Of course, quarantines were only one part of a larger puzzle. In chapter 4, I turn to consider the question of Hajj-related water infrastructures. Here, I trace how the Ottoman state sought to deliberately deploy new forms of techno-scientific discipline in order to simultaneously meet its international sanitary commitments, re-engineer the region's defective environments, and tame its resistant urban and Bedouin populations. In both chapters 3 and 4, I ask how the implementation of European-inspired medical practices, infrastructures, and technologies were understood and received by foreign pilgrims, urban Hijazis, the Bedouins, and the Sharifate of Mecca. And most critically, what were the limitations of Ottoman sanitary and environmental discipline in a religiously conservative, tribal, and traditionally autonomous frontier province? All of these questions, to me, suggest while the colonial archive fixates on international maritime controversies during the period, the Ottoman archive reorients us towards a more complicated collision of inter-imperial rivalry and expertise, and more localized stories of cholera's role in the dynamics of reform and resistance as Istanbul sought to adapt its modernizing visions to the realities of the empire's tribal frontier. So the picture at the top actually is the kind of the germ of what has become my second book project on the history of water infrastructure in the Arabian Peninsula. This picture shows the very first desalination plant in Jeddah. Of course, Saudi Arabia today is the largest producer of man-made desalinated water in the world. Please advance to the next slide. Now, in chapter 5, I explore how the Ottoman state's inability to curtail the Sharifate of Mecca's autonomy shaped the Indian Ocean pilgrimage services economy and field, really. Everything from pilgrimage guides to drinking water to steamship tickets. Instead of thinking of the Sharifate and the Bedouin in this sense as essentially land-based interests, existing apart from the transoceanic industrialization of the steamship Hajj, this chapter demonstrates how both local and trans-imperial Hijazi pilgrimage service providers moved with the times and reimagined and reasserted their authority over the Indian Ocean Hajj. This chapter also examines how the weak mechanisms of inter-imperial regulation and a lack of coordination between Ottoman, British, and international approaches to major questions surrounding indigent pilgrims, passports, and steamship regulations allowed for the growth of an increasingly coercive and corrupt monopoly system governing virtually every aspect of the pilgrimage experience, from steamship tickets and water supplies to pilgrimage guides and camel hires. Please advance to the next slide. And finally, in chapter 6, we decelerate from the industrialized world of the steamship to the supposedly, here I use scare quotes, pre-industrial domain of camel transport. Here again, we find that even the Bedouin world of the camel caravan had also been assimilated into Indian Ocean pilgrimage services and the monopolies that were created. So I'm kind of making the argument that even the Bedouin themselves had been integrated into the capitalist world of the steamship Hajj of the Indian Ocean. Thus, instead of the figure of the atavistic Bedouin blindly defending a timeless traditional Hijaz against the forces of modernization, we find Bedouin camel guides, the Sharifate, and even an Ottoman governor acting as innovators and defenders of a new synthesis of steam and camel labor. In turn, we find each of these actors presented with a stark choice between protecting their own entrenched commercial interests in the Indian Ocean steamship Hajj and caravan economies, or to serve the advance of Ottoman centralization being conveyed along the Hijaz telegraph and railway lines at the time. In a kind of ironic twist, the overlapping crises of mobility and sovereignty surrounding the steamship Hajj proved instrumental in framing the underlying logic for the Hijaz Railway and its utility, and really marshaled the political and financial support for its construction. And yet, between the early 1880s and 1908, the durability of the economic and political alliances forged around the local administration of steamship and camel transport that linked Ottoman officials, the Sharifate, urban Hijazis, and the Bedouin, in turn worked assiduously to undermine Istanbul's rail-based technical solutions. In the end, sovereignty and administrative competence that this ultimate pan-Islamic symbol sought to project would remain an incomplete and unfinished project, stalled in Medina and denied by the Hijaz's stubbornly durable autonomy, even before the empire's British rivals struck the final blow to Ottoman rule during the famous Arab Revolt. Please, you can advance to the next slide. And finally, I would like to end with just a taste of the epilogue here. I examine the legacies and afterlives of the modern Hajj forged between the Ottoman and British empires. In these concluding sections, I examine how World War I and the ouster of the Ottoman Empire from Arabia revived Britain's long latent fantasies of transferring the caliphate to the Sharif of Mecca. Ultimately, though, this ill-fated project was met with almost universal anger in India and across the Islamic world. And yet, even in its failure, Britain's long campaign to place the Hijaz and the Hajj under British protection unleashed global shockwaves. In the years following World War I, the Ottoman Empire, turned Turkish Republic, would abolish the caliphate, and even as Indian Muslims were rallying to its defense. Now, though the Hashemite kingdom and the puppet caliphate that Britain had tried to foster was rapidly overthrown by the Wahhabi Saudi forces that ultimately shaped the Saudi Arabia that we know today, the international administration of the ocean-going Hajj would remain under British League of Nations and then World Health Organization control until 1956, 1957. So really, for the better part of a century, European colonialism prevailed over Islam's most sacred rites. By tracing the slow decolonization of the Hajj, we find a modern pilgrimage system shaped by the legacies and scars of decades of inter-imperial rivalry, and ultimately the pathologization of pious mobility. Perhaps more than ever, these lessons, I think, are relevant to the world of COVID-19 that we find ourselves living in today. Thank you very much.